Buying into Canon RF can feel confusing. You want the Canon autofocus, the colors, the full-frame upgrade, or maybe an R50, an R10, an R7, an R8, or an R6 Mark II. But then you realize the lens choice can make or break the whole system. Pick the wrong lens, and your camera feels limited. Pick the right one, and suddenly Canon RF feels lighter, cheaper, more useful, and more fun than people say. These are 10 affordable Canon RF lenses I would actually consider in 2026. And number 1 is the surprise lens that finally makes RF feel exciting on a budget. You are watching Alt Buzz Lenses, so if lens guides built around real shooting problems are your thing, hit subscribe before we start counting down. At number 10, we have the Canon RF 16mm f2.8 STM. Every kit zoom eventually hits a wall, and for most Canon shooters, that wall is width. You are standing in a small room, or at the edge of a canyon, or inside a cathedral, and the frame simply will not go wide enough. This lens exists to break that wall, cheaply. It is not a professional ultra-wide zoom, and it should not be sold as one. It leans on digital correction to hit its field of view, and the corners will not satisfy someone chasing perfection. But that was never the point. The point is access. For travel, for interiors, for that one establishing shot you did not think your Canon camera could get. 16mm opens a door that used to cost far more to walk through. It is small enough to leave permanently attached to a second body, or tucked into a jacket pocket for the moments you never plan for. Vloggers use it for arm's-length framing because it swallows an entire room without stepping back. Real estate shooters reach for it when a hallway leaves no space to work with. And for landscape photographers still deciding whether wide-angle work is even their thing, this is the cheapest possible way to find out before committing to something heavier. There is also a kind of confidence this lens gives beginners that more expensive wide-angle zooms rarely do, simply because the stakes feel lower. Nobody worries about scratching a lens that costs this little, which means it actually gets used in the rain, on hikes, in crowded markets where a bigger zoom would stay zipped in the bag. And because it is so light, it barely changes the balance of the camera in your hand, so switching to it mid-shoot never feels like a decision. For a lens this affordable, that kind of everyday usability is worth more than another stop of corner sharpness. But width is only one problem. Sometimes the real issue is that your Canon camera is simply not small enough to carry every day. At number 9, we have the Canon RF 28mm f2.8 STM. This is the pancake. The lens so thin it almost disappears on the front of an EOS R body. And that thinness matters more than the spec sheet suggests, because the biggest camera upgrade many photographers actually need is not more resolution or more speed. It is a setup they will actually bring with them. Strap this onto a full-frame Canon body, and the whole system stops feeling like a decision and starts feeling like a habit. It is not fast enough for tight portraits, and it will not satisfy anyone chasing shallow depth of field. But for street photography, for family moments, for the days you almost left the camera at home, this lens is the reason you did not. There is something almost old-fashioned about shooting with a lens this simple. No zoom ring to think about, no focal length to negotiate, just 28mm and whatever is in front of you. It forces a kind of discipline that photographers often forget they enjoy, moving your feet instead of your fingers. And because it barely adds any weight or bulk to the body, it quietly becomes the lens that never leaves the bag, which in the end may be its biggest advantage. It also changes how people react to the camera itself. A full-frame body with a pancake like this looks unassuming, almost like a point-and-shoot, which means strangers relax around it in a way they never quite do around a lens with a long barrel pointed at them. Street photographers notice this immediately. Parents notice it too, at the dinner table, at the park, in the small, unguarded moments that a bigger lens tends to interrupt just by existing. The photos this lens takes are rarely dramatic, but they are often the ones people actually keep. But once the light drops, or you want stronger separation from the background, a tiny pancake stops being enough. That is where Canon's most obvious affordable prime still earns its place. At number 8, we have the Canon RF 50mm f1.8 STM. It is obvious, almost a cliché at this point, and it still belongs on this list, because this is usually the lens that teaches a Canon shooter what a fast aperture actually does to an image. The blur behind a subject, the way low light stops being a problem and starts being a mood. Nobody buys this lens because it is exotic. They buy it because at some point, every Canon RF shooter wants to see what a wide aperture prime feels like, and this is the cheapest, easiest way to find out. The autofocus is basic, the build is plastic, but as a first prime, it still works. It is often the first lens that makes a photographer stop and actually look at a photo they just took, rather than simply checking whether it is in focus. Indoors, at a birthday table, in a dim living room after sunset, this is the lens that keeps working when a kit zoom quietly gives up. It will not be the last 50mm someone owns, but for a huge number of Canon shooters, it is the one that started the obsession with aperture in the first place. Part of its appeal is how little it asks of you. There is no zoom to think through, no aperture ring to fuss over, just a single focal length that forces you to think about composition instead of gear. That simplicity is exactly why so many photographers describe it as the lens that taught them to actually see, rather than just point and shoot. Years later, long after they have moved on to sharper, faster, far more expensive primes, a surprising number of Canon shooters admit this is still the lens sitting quietly in the bottom of the bag, just in case. But if you want a lens that feels useful every single day, there is another affordable RF prime that may make even more sense. At number 7, we have the Canon RF 35mm f1.8 IS Macro STM. 35mm includes more of the world than 50 does. It works indoors. It lets you tell the story around the subject, not just the subject itself. And because this lens focuses in close for near macro results, it becomes flexible in a way a standard prime rarely is. If the 50mm is the prime most Canon shooters notice first, this is the one many of them end up using more. It is not an L lens, and it will not satisfy someone chasing the cleanest possible rendering. But for street work, for travel, for the small details that make a bigger story feel real, 35mm keeps earning its place in the bag. Image stabilization also changes what this lens can do after dark, letting you hold a slower shutter speed without a tripod and still walk away with something usable. Food photographers lean on the close focusing to fill a frame with texture. Documentary-style shooters like it because 35mm mimics how the eye naturally frames a scene, without the distortion of something wider. For many Canon owners, this quietly becomes the one lens they would keep if every other lens had to go. It also happens to be one of the most convincing arguments for shooting with a single prime for an extended trip. Because the focal length sits so close to how we naturally perceive a scene, it removes the temptation to constantly zoom and reframe, and instead pushes a photographer toward composing with their feet. Travelers who commit to it for even a single week often describe a strange kind of clarity that comes from having fewer choices to make, and more attention left over for the moment actually happening in front of them. But not every Canon RF shooter is working in full frame. And for APS-C bodies like the R50, the R10, and the R7, the next lens solves one of the biggest kit-building problems there is. At number 6, we have the Sigma 18-50mm f2.8 DCDN Contemporary for Canon RF. Canon's APS-C shooters needed this lens before it existed. A compact, constant aperture standard zoom that actually matches what an R50 or an R10 body is capable of, instead of a slow kit lens holding it back. This is not for full-frame Canon users. It will not replace a full-frame standard zoom, and it does not have the reach of a super zoom. But for the RF-S shooter who wanted their APS-C system to feel complete, this lens is the difference between a camera waiting for lenses and a real, working system. The constant f2.8 aperture across the entire zoom range means the exposure does not shift as you zoom in and out, which matters enormously for video work and for anyone shooting fast-moving subjects. It covers everything from group shots to tighter portraits without a lens change, which makes it the kind of lens travelers and event shooters reach for and simply never take off. For a lot of APS-C Canon owners, this is the first lens that makes the kit feel like it was built with intention rather than compromise. It also happens to be the lens that convinces a lot of hesitant APS-C shooters that they do not need to jump to full frame just to get a serious result. The zoom range covers enough ground that it can genuinely function as someone's only lens for weeks at a time, whether that means a weekend trip or a full-day event. And because Sigma built it specifically with these smaller bodies in mind, the balance in hand feels intentional in a way that adapted full-frame lenses rarely manage. But once portraits become the priority, a standard zoom can only go so far. Canon's next affordable lens gives users the portrait look without jumping straight to luxury glass. If you enjoy lens guides that explain what is actually worth buying, instead of just recommending the most expensive glass, this is a good moment to subscribe to AltBuzz lenses. We are only halfway through the list, and the next few lenses solve some of the biggest problems Canon shooters run into. At number 5, we have the Canon RF 85mm f2 Macro IS STM. Portraits change everything about how a photographer thinks about a lens, and 85mm is where that change usually begins. This lens gives Canon RF shooters that classic portrait compression, along with close focusing that lets it double as a detail lens for weddings, products, and lifestyle work. It is f2, not f1.4, and it will not out-resolve Canon's premium 85mm L lenses. Nobody is claiming it should. But for photographers who want people photography and close-up detail without convincing themselves they need the most expensive 85 in the system, this lens is the smarter, cheaper answer. The macro focusing is what separates it from a typical portrait prime, letting a photographer go from a full-length portrait to a close detail of a ring or a flower without switching lenses mid-session. Built-in stabilization also helps steady those close-up shots, where even small hand movement becomes obvious. For newer portrait photographers especially, this lens removes the pressure of an expensive purchase, while still delivering the look clients actually expect to see. There is also a psychological effect this lens has on beginning portrait photographers that rarely gets discussed. Because it costs so much less than the L-series alternative, it removes the fear of experimenting, of trying a new pose, a new angle, a new light source, without worrying about whether an expensive investment is being justified. That freedom to experiment often produces better portraits than a more clinical, more expensive lens ever could, simply because the photographer relaxes into the process instead of overthinking every frame. But not every Canon shooter wants to build a bag out of primes. Some just need one affordable full-frame zoom that can cover real work, every single day. At number 4, we have the Canon RF 28-70mm f2.8 IS STM. This lens exists because of one of the loudest complaints about Canon RF. There was no realistic path into a fast, constant aperture standard zoom. This is that path. It starts at 28mm instead of 24, and it is not built like Canon's professional L-series standard zoom. Those are real compromises. But the aperture is still f2.8. The versatility is still there for events, travel, and low-light interiors. And the price finally makes that aperture accessible to more than just working professionals. It is not Canon's luxury zoom. It is Canon finally giving more photographers a real way into one. Built-in image stabilization compensates for the narrower maximum aperture at the long end, which matters when you are working indoors without flash. It is the kind of lens a beginner shooting their first paid event can actually justify, and the kind of lens a hobbyist can hold on to through years of casual travel and family photography. The 28mm starting point takes some adjustment if you are used to 24, but most shooters stop noticing the difference within a single outing. It also tends to become the lens photographers reach for when they genuinely do not know what the day will bring. A wedding that moves from a wide shot of the venue to a tight candid across the room. A family trip that swings from a group photo to a quiet close-up. All of it happens inside this single zoom range. That kind of unpredictability is exactly where a do-everything lens like this earns its keep, because there is simply no time to be changing primes when the moment is already happening. But some Canon shooters do not need f2.8 first. They need reach, and Canon has one budget telephoto that became impossible to ignore. At number 3, we have the Canon RF 100 to 400mm f5.6 to 8 IS USM. Most Canon shooters assume wildlife photography starts with a giant white lens and a professional budget. This lens exists to prove that assumption wrong. 400mm of reach, in a size and price that finally lets curious shooters try birds, safari, sports, and distant landscapes without a 5-figure commitment. It slows down at the long end, and it wants good light to perform at its best. It is not a replacement for Canon's fastest professional telephotos, but as an entry point into long-reach photography, as the lens that lets a Canon shooter find out if they even like wildlife photography before spending seriously, this lens changed what was possible on a budget. The variable aperture means the lens gets slower as you zoom toward 400mm, so bright days and fast shutter speeds get the best results out of it. It is light enough to be handheld for an entire afternoon at a zoo or a local park, which is more than can be said for most telephoto zooms in this range. For a first attempt at wildlife photography, or a family trip where a big lens simply is not practical to carry, this is the one that quietly gets used the most. There is also a confidence-building effect that comes from owning a lens this unintimidating. Photographers who would never approach wildlife photography with an enormous, conspicuous white lens often feel far more comfortable carrying this one into a park, onto a trail, or through an airport. It photographs like a serious tool without behaving like an obstacle, and that alone convinces a surprising number of Canon shooters to finally try the kind of photography they had been putting off for years. But Canon's affordable story is no longer only about Canon's own lenses. The next lens matters because it gives RF-S shooters something they had been waiting for. At number 2, we have the Sigma 10 to 18mm f2.8 DCDN, contemporary for Canon RF. Canon's APS-C bodies are small, capable, and genuinely appealing, but they needed lenses that match that potential. This Sigma gives RF-S shooters a serious, fast, constant aperture ultra-wide, built for vlogging, interiors, landscapes, and the kind of tight spaces where a standard zoom simply cannot help. It is specialized. Full-frame Canon shooters have no reason to buy this as their main wide lens. But for the RF-S creator who wanted their camera to finally feel like it had room to grow into something bigger, this lens is exactly that room. The constant f2.8 aperture makes it genuinely usable indoors and after dark, not just for bright landscape work, which is where a lot of budget ultra-wides quietly fall apart. Handheld video shooters like how forgiving the wide field of view is when walking and talking to camera, since small movements barely register on screen. For creators building a channel around travel, real estate, or interiors on an APS-C Canon body, this lens tends to become the one permanently left on. It also solves a very specific frustration that a lot of RF-S owners had been quietly living with, which is the sense that their camera body had outgrown the lenses available to it. This Sigma changes that dynamic completely, because it finally gives a small Canon body a lens capable of matching its ambitions, rather than holding them back. For anyone building a channel or a portfolio entirely around an APS-C setup, this is often the lens that makes the whole system finally click into place. But number 1 is different. It is the lens that makes Canon RF feel exciting on a budget, because it gives shooters something Canon usually keeps expensive: very fast glass. At number 1, we have the Canon RF 45mm f1.2 STM. Canon has been criticized for years over how expensive its fastest glass is. This lens is the answer to that criticism. An f1.2 aperture in a prime small enough and affordable enough that it no longer belongs only to photographers with a professional budget. It is not the cleanest Canon RF lens, and it is not the most corrected. There are compromises in how it renders at its widest aperture, and nobody should pretend otherwise. But its appeal was never about perfection. It is about possibility, about shallow depth of field and low light confidence finally reaching photographers who never expected fast RF glass to be within their reach. That is why it is number one. Not because it is flawless, but because it changes what affordable Canon RF can feel like. Wide open, backgrounds dissolve into soft color almost completely, giving images a look that used to require spending several times as much. On an APS-C body, it behaves closer to a portrait focal length, which quietly makes it a favorite among RF-S shooters as well as full-frame owners. For anyone who assumed fast glass was permanently out of reach on Canon RF, this lens is the moment that assumption stops being true. There is a reason this lens keeps coming up in conversations among Canon shooters who never expected to be talking about fast glass at all. It is not just the aperture number, though f1.2 on its own turns heads. It is the feeling of holding a lens that behaves like the expensive option, without carrying the expensive price, and realizing that the gap between budget and premium Canon glass may finally be starting to close. If you shoot Canon RF or RF-S, tell me which affordable lens made the system feel better for you. And is there one budget Canon lens on this list, or missing from it, that you think deserves more respect? I want to hear it in the comments. Canon RF can still get expensive very quickly. There is no point pretending otherwise. But these 10 lenses prove the system was never as far out of reach as it looked. Every focal length here is a door, not a luxury. And once you walk through enough of them, the system finally feels like yours. If you enjoy lens guides that help you build smarter camera systems without wasting money, subscribe to AltBuzz Lenses. Until next time, keep chasing the glass that actually earns its place in your bag.